Hello, everyone. I don't know how to work this at all, do I? Okay. There we go. Okay, so, yeah, I can only, now that it's a year later, I guess it did go pretty well last year, so I only have room to disappoint. I'm excited about that. So I kind of wanted to talk to you guys and kind of, having been in your position only a couple of years ago and now worked for a couple of years, like John said at Mount Sinai, I kind of have a somewhat of a perspective for, the kinds of things that, that surprised me in having my first job and the things that, even, a year, 6 months, a year into having my first job that, still surprised me. Things that I wish I would have paid more attention to, things that, you don't worry if you don't learn. No, I mean, just kind of the things to expect as you kind of, transition. I don't know, people have somewhat different backgrounds. Hopefully, I'm kind of giving this talk for people that, aren't dosimetrists or don't have previous experience in the field because, that was the case that I was in, and in my experience, that was the case most of my classmates were in. So hopefully that applies to you guys. And, I don't know if all of you have found jobs already or not, but I know that that's probably something that's on all of your mind. So let's see what I'm going to talk about. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about kind of the medical physics field and how it's broken up and the different avenues that you can kind of go into. And then I guess the best way to tell you what it's like to be a medical physicist is kind of take you through, I think, from a patient's perspective, which was the thing that I didn't have any idea what was about. As you're learning these things in the books and all that kind of stuff, you don't ever get a chance to get the bigger picture. And because no one ever put that bigger picture together for me, it took me a long time to figure out what the bigger picture was just by piecing it together. So I'll kind of go through what that does and, where physics fits into that bigger picture and kind of what everyone else does and how everyone works together. Because I think that's one of the neatest and most challenging parts of this field is that it's really multidisciplinary. You work with all kinds of people. You work with therapists that are treating the patients that usually have usually an associate's degree, sometime a bachelor's degree. You have you're a physicist, a master's degree or PhD, and then you have MDs that obviously are doctors, and there's a lot of stuff that goes with that, and ego and that kind of thing, and you're kind of in the middle of that, and you have to juggle all those things, and you're kind of the one person, I think, more than anyone else that has to work with that whole group of people. And I think that kind of is a lot of excitement and a lot of challenge to the field. And then kind of tell you, instead of from a patient perspective, but from my perspective, what a typical day for me is like. And kind of a little bit as far as referring to the courses that you guys are taking of what I wish I would have paid more attention to, and a little bit of what I'm glad I didn't really care about that because it doesn't really matter, that kind of thing. And then kind of a little bit about the transitioning and getting a job and those kinds of things. I also have a handout for you guys, and if we have time, I'll talk about preparing for the ABR. That's probably not on most of your minds right now, but if anyone wants to stay around and that kind of thing, I can certainly talk about that since I just did that a couple of months ago. So, as you guys well know, there's kind of 4 different specializations in the field. I imagine, so there's nuclear physics, health safety physics, diagnostic, and therapy. Those are kind of the 4 broad things. Some people break diagnostic down into MRI kind of does their own thing, and then diagnostic kind of encompasses everything else, X-rays, CT scans, all that kind of stuff. And so as I'm sure you guys are all well aware, most everybody does therapy. About 77% of the people in medical physics profession are therapy physicists. And kind of the next biggest chunk is diagnostic, and then everyone else kind of is broken up among the other things. The other category, which is a small category, is mostly engineers, but not all. It's other. That's why it's other. But mostly engineers. So in addition to the 4 different types of medical physicists, there's kind of 4 different settings in which you can work. There's a million different settings, but I kind of tried to pick the 4 biggest as I see them and kind of how they're important. That I think might be of interest as you look for a job, and if you're lucky enough to have a choice, can kind of put that into perspective when you look for the job. There's academic types places associated with a medical school, places like Mount Sinai, local places, Memorial. Sloan Kettering, what else? Columbia, those kinds of places. Those places tend to get more complicated cases. They tend to get a wider variety of patients. They tend to do a wider variety of treatments. They tend to be more on the cutting edge of technology, have newer equipment. Not newer equipment, that's definitely not true, but when new things come out, they tend to be the first in line to kind of get those things. They have the resources to do that. And it's kind of, I think, a fun environment to be in because, you have medical physics students, you have a lot of people kind of at the beginning of their career. And so I feel like that's the environment that I felt that I like really a lot because you kind of have a lot of camaraderie. Then there's, consulting groups. And consulting groups, I'm sure you guys, is this stuff that you guys are all pretty familiar with, or is this stuff that is new to you? I mean, consulting groups are kind of, not everyone at once. I didn't give you a chance to answer. I'll just say it anyway. So consulting groups are groups that are usually owned by physicists, but occasionally owned by doctors. And they have a group then, and then hospitals will contract out to that group of people, and then that one single consulting group will then usually serve multiple hospitals. And so your day can involve, traveling from site to site, that kind of thing. Consulting groups are usually more profit-oriented, and so things are done with that in mind. There's less interest in doing risky treatments because, there's less interest in exposing themselves to that. There's less, there's a more interest in doing things quickly and doing things profitably. Not that that's bad or good. I'm just saying that tends to be how it is. So that's academic. Private hospitals, I don't have a lot of experience with those. Private or private practices. And again, that can be, more profit-oriented, and so it tends to be safer treatments, less adventurous treatments. Both of these have much less research as a rule than an academic center will try and do, so they're more open to your interest in doing that research, or there's the availability to participate in others' research. The other nice thing about academic centers is that they tend to run through a lot of protocols. So if you have a certain research that you're interested in, a clinical type of research, you're interested in doing some research on prostate brachytherapy implants. Well, if you're at an academic center, you might have 1,000 patients to choose from treated at your hospital, If you're at a, consulting or private type of place, you might have, 10 people over the last, year to choose from. So it could really vary. And then there's government. Government usually, I don't know anyone that works in a government facility, but that's like the VA hospitals. Tends to be a lot less money, very usually arcane, older types of treatments. So that's all I have to say about that. The only other thing is that consulting can be really varied because you could be, like I said, working at different hospitals, do different sorts of things. But that's also can be a place where you tend to get put, in a room and do as many prostate plans as you can for me, and that's all you do. Because again, that's how you're most efficient to them. Because you can, once you do one thing, you get more and more efficient doing that one thing, and so keep on doing that one thing. And so, you can kind of get stuck in that sort of rut. And so that's kind of the different environments. As far as the breakdown goes, about 54% of medical physicists in the United States, this is just for oncology, are MS degrees, and about 46% are PhDs. And this is all from the salary survey. If you're a student member of AAPM, you can get all this online. I just compiled it for you. So any questions about this so far? You guys look enthralled. All right. So here's kind of the typical path that a patient kind of goes through to kind of give you the bigger perspective. I'm going to tell you this perspective from assuming the patient's going to get like an external beam therapy or treated with the Linac. That's obviously not always the case, but it's kind of I think in most places that's the main kind of treatment. It comprises, 80-90% of our treatment at Mount Sinai, and I'm guessing it's the majority of treatments, unless you're in a really specialized, strange sort of place. It's the majority. For many places, it's the only thing they do. They don't have other kinds of specialized treatments. So that's kind of the bread and butter. So that's what I start with. So a patient comes in, and radiation radiation oncology is a referral service. You know, if you have a pain in your neck, you don't say, I'm going to go see a radiation oncologist. No, you go say, I'm going to see your doctor, and then if the doctor suspects cancer, he'll refer you then not to a radiation oncologist, but a medical oncologist. And then the medical oncologist will then usually decide if it's going to be treated with chemotherapy or surgery, and somewhere in the line, either radiation fits into that plan with chemo or with surgery, or it's, you know, instead of that kind of other stuff. So that's what I mean by it's a referral service. So patients don't come to radiation oncology. Patients are given to radiation oncology by other physicians. So, like I said, it comes to the referring physician. Referring physician then refers to radiation oncology. And from there, it goes to the radiation oncology physician. And their first step then is to take whatever the disease is and take into mind whatever other kinds of treatment the patient's getting, whether that be chemo or surgery, and decide, you know, how they're going to treat the patient, what dose they're going to treat, and what modality they're going to treat. Now, this is kind of an idealized case. Many times, you know, if I were to draw this, it would be kind of like, instead of a nice thing, which it's going to look like, I mean, there'd be arrows here and loops around here. I mean, it often ends up being a huge mess. But kind of in an idealized, simple case, this is kind of how it works. So they decide what the dose is and that sort of thing, and then assuming they're going to, and the modality that they're going to treat with, assuming they're going to be treated with external beam therapy, then the patient, oh, look at this. No, let's talk more about the thing. Whoops. So yeah, okay, like I said, based on the disease type and staging, they'll decide the modality and dose, and this isn't quite as complicated as I sound. You know, I don't know what conception I had, but, you know, every prostate cancer, not everyone, you know, 90% of prostate cancers are pretty much the same. It's not like someone comes in with prostate cancer and, oh, how are we going to treat it today? No, I mean, things are really routine, and I think in medicine in general, things are really routine like that. And when you work in a place where most of what you do is routine cases, you know, things, you know, there's probably 5 or 6 different cases which you could, you know, categorize, pigeonhole every single other case into, and I mean, things don't really vary that much. So it's not really like you're, you know, changing things that much every day. So the modalities that the doctors have to choose from predominantly are external beam, which can be photons or electrons, and brachytherapy, which can be high dose rate, low dose rate. I'll kind of talk more about all of these later. And then stereotactic therapy, which can be single fraction stereotactic radiosurgery, or like a hypofractionated treatment, which instead of a treatment, normally patients get treated 5 days a week. Cancer takes Saturday and Sunday off for 5 or 6 weeks. That was a funny joke. You guys should have laughed a little louder at that. And so they get treated 5 days a week for 5 or 6 weeks, and then that will be their treatment. And so what hypofractionated means, the patients will get they'll get, you know, still a close to as high of a dose of radiation, but broken down instead of over 25 treatments into 5 or 6 treatments, maybe 10 treatments. And so with that kind of a thing, it kind of has its own category because there's a lot more risk that's involved with that kind of treatment and that sort of thing. And for the hypofractionated, it's kind of broken up into 2 categories, cranial and SBRT, which is stereotactic body radiotherapy. And so those are kind of the treatment modalities. I'll talk a little more about those, but any questions at this point? Okay, great. Okay, so here is the illustration, schematic, if you will, of the kinds of machines that we have at Mount Sinai, the different treatments that we do. We have 3 machines. This is a Novalis machine. It doesn't matter what it is. It's called a Novalis. It's what we use primarily for radiosurgery. It has the most accurate it has the most accurate treatment, so that's what it's used for radiosurgery. This is the multi-leaf collimator machine, which we do predominantly all of our IMRT or intensity modulated treatments on. This is a 600C, which is an older machine that we actually cut blocks, and it's for conformal 3D therapy. I'll kind of explain these things later. And then that little guy on the end is called an HDR afterloader, which is what does our high dose rate brachytherapy. So those are all to scale. Oh, I do. I've never used a laser pointer before. All right. Here we go. Okay. So after the radiation oncology, after the oncologist decides what kind of treatment they're going to do, then the patient, assuming it's external beam, then the patient goes for simulation, which is the simulation is usually done nowadays on a 3D sim. Basically what it is, it's a CAT scan. And the patient is put into the position that they're going to be treated with whatever kinds of immobilization devices they're going to be using. And so some of those are an aquaplast, alpha cradle. I have a picture of those on the next slide. I'll kind of show those. But this was kind of a whole new thing to me when getting into this field, because I imagine for someone that's been a dosimetrist before, this made a lot of sense. But there's something called a breast board. Patients for treating for breast cancer are treated on, and the arm is put up in this little kind of immobilized in this sling. And you just, as a physicist, having studied, for Wu's class and doing all those goofy diagrams that you guys have done 100 times, like this, and I mean, you just don't have a concept of, well, why can't they just move their arm down? It just didn't make any sense to me, because if you've never seen it, it's really hard to understand that bigger picture. And so that wasn't that funny. You guys should laugh at the other jokes more. So anyway, so that's where the patient sim. There's also a thing called a traditional sim. I'm not going to talk much about it because no one really uses it anymore. I don't know. Does anyone have? Simon, do you guys use a traditional sim? Do you guys use that for anything? It's basically like an X-ray machine in the shape of a gantry for the treatment. You guys have all seen a Linac, right? You guys know what I mean when I say gantry? Okay. So it's basically like one of those, only instead of shooting out MV radiation, it shoots out KV radiation to take images. But so typically what's done is a CT is taken, and the patient is mobilized in whatever way is appropriate. If it's a head and neck, they often use what's called an aquaplast, which is a mask that is put over the patient. It's heated up or chemical. It's heated up, yeah. And so it conforms then to the patient's face, and that's what mobilizes them. There's also usually something that goes down to immobilize their shoulders. It's kind of creepy. I mean, it is. Some of this stuff can be hard to stomach when you first get into it. And then an alpha cradle is this. There's a bunch of them. There's some that are inflatable that have these like little foam beads in them, and you suck all the air out, and it takes the right shape. There's some that do it chemically. You put this like plaster stuff in it, but what you're trying to do is get the patient in a reproducible position that will be the same every single day. So once you get that set up, you do your plan on it, and so you have the patient's position from the plan, and then every day it's a matter of them just getting on the couch. You set them up the same way they were the day before, and then you treat them. So, okay, any questions so far? Ask a question, jeez. All right. So then from there, things go to physics. And the reason I put the exchange with the MD is because that's a big part. That's kind of where the MD becomes, I guess, involved again. Really, if you think about it, physics and MD could be involved in all of these things. But I didn't want to do that because A, that would have looked not as cool and too complicated, and B, it's because just they're involved less so. But I know at a lot of places physics is there for every simulation. At Mount Sinai, we're not at all. And so it really varies. And so, a lot of times they'll ask physics advice. Should I put the arm this way? Should I put the arm this way? How do you want to do it? And so, or they'll ask the dosimetrist, whoever's planning. But when it goes to physics, that's kind of when the planning begins, and the way that the planning starts is the doctor will get a better idea from looking at the CT of what they're treating. And at this point, this is where things can kind of change. If the doctor was originally going to treat with IMRT and says, oh no, now we're going to treat with 3D, or I didn't realize it was this close to this structure, this is where some changes kind of happen, because this is where the doctor is probably getting their best visual look at what the cancer looks like. And so then what happens is that usually the physician will come in and they'll usually draw the PTV. And the PTV is the planning treatment volume, which is the volume that defines what you're treating. That's their responsibility to define what the cancer is and what they want to have treated. And then depending on where you are and how lucky you are, the physician will then either leave you to draw all the normal tissues that are of concern, or will do that to some degree themselves. At Mount Sinai, for example, they usually do the complicated stuff, and then the simple, easy to delineate stuff like the bladder, the rectum, things like that are left to physics. But that really varies. I've heard of places where physics does almost everything except for the PTV. So, a question, yes.
How do they actually draw these? It used to be that the guy would come in with a wax pencil and go on a film.
Oh, it's so funny how this works. So the way that the drawing used to work was absolutely horrible. They used to take And some doctors, this is the best part. See, for whatever reason, doctors are above having to keep up with the technology, and if they learn the way they want to do it, that's the way they want to do it, and that's the way they're going to do it. And so we have some doctors that like to do it this way, so they still do it this way. So when the doctors are defining their treatment area, what they do now is they just draw using a mouse on a computer, and then it's there for everyone to see and enjoy. But what they used to do, and what some still like to do, is they take a film printout. I don't know why I have to draw this, but they take a film printout, and then they'll take a wax crayon on the x-ray, and they'll draw the shape that they want to treat on that thing, right? Then physics gets the best job called digitizing this, which what that means is if you do that by hand, I don't know if there's a way to scan it in and do that now, but if you do digitizing by hand, you put this on a whiteboard and you go through and trace what they just drew with a little thing that puts the coordinates into a computer. So now you've taken what they drew what they could have drawn with a mouse, but instead chose to draw with a crayon on a film, and now you've traced it, and now it's in the computer. So that's what you're referring to. That's not usually done anymore, but again, if a physician likes to do it that way, that's the way they're going to do it. So what the end product is, and this is an example of a prostate case, is you have a CT with all of these structures delineated. And so it doesn't really matter what they are, but for fun, this is the rectum, which physics defines this volume. This is the bladder, physics defines that, and then this is the prostate and seminal vesicles, which the physician defines. And so once you have this, the planning is ready to begin. So any questions about this? So one of the other advances that has come since the CT was around is that we have what's called 3D planning, which has been around for a long time, so I'm not going to explain that. Yeah?
That's right. For us who took the anatomy course at TC, I don't think this is adequate for us to recognize every slice, what structure it is, and how do you go through that period?
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know what the current state of the anatomy physiology requirement here is, but, the one thing that was, the more anatomy that you know, the better. The physiology doesn't really matter. I mean, that doesn't matter really at all. I think that, certain structures, you see them once and you're an expert on it. There's not that much else to see. But, other structures are more difficult. And, I spend the vast majority of my working life looking at these. So, you get to know, I feel to some point that a lot of physicists or dosimetrists can probably draw a better contour than a physician can, just because they're looking at them all the time. And so you get...
You have a question or not sure about certain structure. Who would you ask without being looked like a stupid or
right?
You don't
so
ask the MD for that.
Being at an academic place, we're fortunate. I'll ask one of the residents because they can let me know because they don't know anything either, and so it's a comfortable situation. I can say, hey, and they don't hold anything against you. But physicians usually are pretty understanding of that sort of thing. I think where physicians get frustrated, which I think is one of the things I'll talk about a little bit. I'll just talk about it now. I think it's important that you know terminology pretty well. I think that physicians appreciate when you can talk about, the medial aspect of the breast versus the lateral aspect, or the, caudal aspect, or things like that. I think when you start throwing around words like, when you say, the inner part of the leg, how do you know these things? We didn't go to medical school, but I think that you engender a lot of respect from the physician when you can speak in their language about these things and aren't having to. So, one of the first things I did when getting the job was get used to all those terms, sagittal, coronal, all those kinds of things, caudal, all those sorts of things. So I think if you can speak in their language, that kind of ingratiates you more quickly. And ingratiating is an important part. So once they do that, then they'll usually give constraints on all the structures you've defined. And again, it's not reinventing the wheel every time. Pretty much every prostate, you have the same constraints for the rectum and the bladder. You have the same tissues to avoid. For most of the sites you deal with, you have pretty much the same kinds of things to do. But, and then this is another important thing where you don't get anything from school, but I think it's important to have a decent idea. Every institution is different. Some places will let the spinal cord get 45 gray. Some places will let it get 50. Some places will get 47. But I think it's a good idea before you start your first job, or, before you volunteer, to have some idea of that. You don't need to know if the cord should get 45 or 50, but you should know if it should get 45 or 450. I think you should have a general idea.
How do they get this?
How do they get this? Oh, I don't know. They magic pick it out of the sky.
How did the students find out?
Oh, how did the students find out? You know, I printed out a great sheet for you guys last year on all of these things, but have since lost it. So I didn't print it out this year. But I can try and get something to you, and maybe you can pass it around. There's a paper. I can provide a reference to it. There's a paper, an old paper by Imani that people use. I don't know if people use that anymore. It's pretty old. It was written like 17 years ago. I don't know. You get it pretty quickly from your institution, but I think there's some planning books. I think some of the references on here that I have to pass out will give you a general idea of those sorts of things. So, okay, so then on goes to the treatment planning. The two basic types of treatment planning are 3D and IMRT. And so this is kind of I don't know how familiar you guys are with this, but basically what you're doing is you have a patient, and you have a PTV, and you're centralizing the dose by coming at it with beams from all different directions. Because the more directions you choose, you notice that the one part that they're all hitting is here, and in this region here it's only this beam, and in this region here, so you end up getting something where the dose is centralized here and is cooler in all the other regions. That's just geometry. And so you kind of have two ways to handle that. One way is with conformal 3D therapy, which is basically where you take a block and you cut it around the shape of what you're treating, and so that gives you more or less a dose in the shape of what you're treating. And so that's one way to do it. But when you're doing that, you're just shaping the beam. From this beam here, you're defining the shape, you're defining the outline, but you're blasting a constant amount of radiation through the beam. Does that make sense? Your beam profile is flat. You're giving a constant dose of radiation all from this direction. So when you look at this dose distribution, you're going to get a big fat isodose that looks like this because all that dose is coming in one big fat thing. Those are all the technical words. And so what intensity modulation does is it uses MLC leaves, or a multi-leaf collimator, to modulate the fluence, not only to shape it, which as you can see it also does, but to actually modulate across the beam the amount of radiation the different parts get. And so as you can see, where it's redder, it's hotter, more radiation, and where it's bluer, it's cooler. And so, as you can see from here, here's the prostate, and one of the major constraints on the prostate is the rectum, which sits right behind it. So as you can guess from here, what the beam is trying to do is it's trying to avoid giving dose from this. So here's how we're looking. Here's the prostate and here's the rectum. It's trying to avoid giving dose to the prostate from this posterior beam, which is going to have to go right through the rectum, and the computer is then going to figure out, with your help, how to, maybe give more dose from this beam here to make up for the lack of dose that's given by this beam here. So usually you'll kind of tend to see, if you have a pretty simple beam arrangement, mirror images of fluence. You'll see one that's cool right here. You rotate around, 90 degrees or whatever, and you'll see one that's hot right in the middle, making up for the one that's cool right in the middle. So those are the two major kinds of treatment. Any questions about this? Okay. So when you put it all together, then you have, in this case, 7 fields, which is, I think that's 7. Yeah, 7. You have 7 fields, and you put it all together, and you get a dose distribution that I can't really play with this, but you can kind of see conforms pretty tightly around the PTV and meets all of the constraints that the doctor requested. So that's kind of that. I kind of wanted to show you this because I kind of wanted to, again, illustrate a little bit of the difference. A prostate plan is pretty, prostate plan, you'll find out, prostate treatment is the, what is it? It's like the little canary that they used to put in the caves to see if it dies. That's the kind of canary of radiation oncology. It's so easy to treat, and it almost cures itself, that every new kind of treatment is tried on it. I mean, I'm sure you've kind of heard probably about proton therapy, and if you look at all the proton facilities in the United States, what do they predominantly treat? They treat prostate. Not because, and people would argue about this, but not because you need this advanced thing to treat prostate cancer, but because might as well try it out on that. I mean, to be honest, where we are, we use our Novalis radiosurgery machine, which is what we use to give tiny doses of radiation, huge amounts of dose to little spots on the brain. We also use that to treat prostates because I don't know. It's just that's kind of the thing that everything is tested out on. And so it's just very simple. It's very straightforward. It's, you know, a physics example, it's like the harmonic oscillator of medical physics. So anyway, so that's kind of an example. This is an example of a more complicated case. This is a nasopharynx cancer, and where before we had two structures to avoid, the rectum and the bladder, here we have quite a bit more, and things that if aren't avoided correctly, you know, have much greater consequences. Here we have the chiasm, the brainstem, the optic nerves, the retina, the lenses, all of the structures of the eye. And so maybe not obvious, but you know, the result of mistreating this area is obviously much, much more critical. And so just to kind of give you a variety of the complexity of treatments. And so so the doctor and the physicist kind of works together and comes up with a plan that they like, and that both agree on, mostly that the doctor agrees on. And then the patient goes to treatment. And from treatment, it's kind of involves to some degree all three people, the therapist, the physics, and the MD. And so the way that it does that is because that kind of becomes the other part of your job. And since the whole thing I explained to you thus far, treatment planning, is something that really, really varies. Not all physics even does treatment planning. At a lot of places in New York, physicists do the treatment planning, but in some places, that's done by a dedicated dosimetrist. And you know, so basically all the stuff I told you is stuff that you probably wouldn't even do. But it's important that you understand well how to do that, because you're kind of the consultant. You're supposed to be the expert, know more about this than the dosimetrist does. I think dosimetrists will tell you that's rarely true, but I mean, that's what your role is supposed to be. They're supposed to be able to look to you to advice. So if you're not the expert and you don't know how to do this, you know, how can you reasonably give that advice? So anyway, the next step is then the quality assurance. And that's such a boring sounding word, and many times it is boring, but that's what we do. And so so basically, in the end, what you're doing with quality assurance is to make sure that the plan that the doctor put their signature on and put their prescription on is what the patient is actually being treated with. That, in the end, is what you're doing. And that's kind of done by a couple of different approaches depending on what kind of treatment it is. It's done with MU calculations, which I'm sure from Dr. Wu's class you guys are loving those, and so that's something that will directly apply to what you do in your job. So that's exciting. So part of it's done with that. Basically, what you're doing is you're second checking the computer's calculation. Another thing is with IMRT QA, which is where you are taking that fluence I showed you on that earlier slide. I would go back, but I'm afraid that's going to mess something up. So, you know, I showed you that fluence, and basically what you're doing is you're putting a piece of film or an array of diodes or something of that nature down, and you're measuring that dose, and you're making sure that what you're actually treating matches what the computer says you should be treating. Does that make sense? You're basically measuring that fluence pattern is accurate. And then again, depending on where you work, your job is also a patient can't be treated unless it has a doctor's prescription and a doctor's signature and a physicist's signature. And so a physicist, you're not signing off on this plan is medically appropriate. That's what the doctor does. But you're signing off that it's physically appropriate. And there's a myriad of things, the reasons it could not be, but it's your job to find those things. And so and then the other part is the hardware kind of part. This is all software stuff. The other part is the hardware. And you know, you do monthly machine calibrations, and you sign off monthly on those calibrations, and you sign off saying that the machine is in adequate condition to deliver appropriate treatments. And so, again, that's something that is all in your hands. It's actually kind of quite a bit of responsibility. If you adjust the dose, if you recalibrate the dose, you recalibrate the jaw, something like that, then you're saying that it's okay to treat patients with that. And for a month, they're going to trust what you said. And so, you know, it's kind of a pretty important thing to do that. So I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. But those are kind of the main aspects. So any questions about that?
Yeah, while you're talking about these various things, you've been through the course, you know what they teach. You might say, well, this is something we do talk about, you got it in Wu's course, or this is something we never covered. So that the audience has a feeling for where to go dig outside.
Okay. I think that MU calculations, I think that you talk about on occasion in Dr. Wu's class, and I think that it's really hard without having any clinical experience to really understand those, because it's multiplying and dividing. But I mean, all it means to most of you guys at this point is the triangle in the box goes to another triangle in a box. And I think until you understand how it's applied, as soon as you understand how it's applied, you're going to go, that's what they were talking about, kind of eureka. But before that, I think it's important to learn as much as you can, but I think that it's really hard to grasp that without seeing how it's applied. I don't know. That's the advice of that. IMRT QA and monthly LINAC. Sorry.
How does this, did practicum help in understanding?
Yeah, so obviously the class is for the MU calculations. As far as IMRT QA and monthly LINAC calibrations, the first time I had to do the monthly LINAC calibration on our simplest machine without an MLC, my boss handed me our packet and said, come back to me at the end of the month with it done. And I was able to do that from just what I learned in practicum. You spend probably one evening, you spend probably 4 or 5 hours doing it. And, to compare that, people that go through a residency program at Memorial spend 3 months doing it. I don't know that it takes 3 months to learn, but it certainly takes more than 4 to 5 hours to learn. But 4 to 5 hours is what you'll get, and that 4 to 5 hours lasted me literally for the first 2 or 3 months of the job until I got on my own feet. And so I think it's important to pick up everything that you can from that, and this stuff is weird. You don't encounter this stuff in any other aspect of life. It's not like you just don't. And so don't let things pass while you're going through the practicum and be like, I'll pick it up later, because you won't. You won't have another opportunity to. So be thorough about that. That would be my advice. Okay. So so then the patient, so you've signed the chart, you said everything's okay, your machine is calibrated, everything's right, and then the patient goes on to treatment. And you're still involved in that to some degree. The chart checks is kind of a big part of what you do as a physicist. I think it's by far the most horrible part of the job. But basically, you're going through the chart every week. And, well, first of all, you go through the chart at the beginning, like I said, make sure that everything is... Oh, a chart is the patient's chart. That has all their record in it. That's where they record the amount of treatment. This can be an electronic chart. Lots of places do everything on the computer. It can be a combination of electronic and a big old, paper binder, or it can be, just a paper thing. If that's the case, that sucks. But so you go through and look through their chart, make sure that everything's in place before the patient starts treatment. You do that again after the patient started, but before they've received their third treatment. That policy is a little different everywhere, but that's what it is where I am. And then every week you check, as the patient's treatment progresses, you check various things depending on what your institution wants. But you check how the patient was set up every day. You make sure that there was nothing, the patient was set up 7 cm different that day. What happened? And so you're checking those kinds of things. The therapists encounter all kinds of things at the machine throughout the week that they might choose to tell or not to tell you about. You have to see, they didn't get treated that day. Were they supposed to not get treated? Did they just forget? You kind of have to do, search about what was wrong with all of those things. And then you do a final check when the patient's done treatment to make sure that the entire treatment that was prescribed was delivered and that the chart is ready to be filed away and, for whatever the patient might go on to next. Yes?
Did you read through volumes of your hospital's procedure and protocols and research to find out what's the convention, what's the...
Not volumes, no.
More simple things.
The Mount Sinai was pretty organized. They had a 6 or 7 page standards for what we expect in a chart check, and I just, read through that. And at first, because this is a really time-consuming, annoying thing. You're basically going through 2 things and checking the 2 numbers match. It could numb your brain. It's horrible. And in addition to that, when you first start doing it, you have 7 pages worth of stuff that you're supposed to be checking. And it just takes you forever because you're like, did I check everything? And then you go back to the thing, okay, I was supposed to check this. It's just, and then you have to thumb through 1 million pages to go back to where you were, and it's a nightmare. But I think once you learn it, once you've done it once, it takes so long that, it kind of becomes in the back of your brain, and you kind of get your own little procedure to learn the most efficient way to do it. So, yeah. Well, not really, but kind of. I guess it's lab. Well, no, lab's not quite that tedious. This is tedious. This is like doing your taxes every day for hours a day. It's horrible. So, good luck with chart checks. And so occasionally you get exciting things that are physics involved. There are physics consults. An example one is in vivo dosimetry, where a patient might be having blistering, a skin reaction, and the doctor says, is the patient really getting the dose we prescribed? And so you have to go actually, and this is one chance to interact with a patient. You don't get many chances as a physicist, but this is one chance, and it might be to measure a blister on the skin, to measure that the dose is being received is what is supposed to be based on the plan. Another part is bolus placement. This bolus is this disgusting, oily stuff that's disgusting, and you have to play. It's used basically to bring the dose. You guys know all about Dmax, right? So Dmax for 6 MV is 1.5 cm from the skin. If you need the dose at the skin to be higher than that, you put bolus on to start the electron equilibrium build up more quickly, and so you have to. I guess it differs, but at Mount Sinai we have to cut that to make sure that it conforms to what the plan was done. You have to make sure that the therapists are placing it right, and that all the kinds of physics things that are important about that are being adhered to. And then in addition to that, the MD is visiting the patient once a week on what's called OTVs, on-treatment visits, to make sure the patient's progressing as they would expect. And at this time, they might choose, either the patient has some different labs that show that the disease is different than they thought, or it's not being handled like they want, and so they might change the dose. And so they don't tell you this usually, so it's kind of your job to say, oh, so they change that and make sure that the therapist knows. That's kind of, well, you're the glue, I'm speaking, because I'm a physicist, so of course we're the most important, but you're kind of the glue that holds everything together, because the doctor changes that prescription, and the therapist, unless they're happen to see it, may never ever see that, and so you're kind of the one that on a weekly basis is checking all this stuff. And then the physician is the one that then is looking at the films that are taken. So every time a patient is, depending on the policy, when a patient's treated, they take orthogonal films, a film from the front and a film from the side, and those two orthogonal films localize the patient. They define the isocenter in the patient. And so the doctor is looking on a weekly or daily basis to make sure that the isocenter matches what it is on the CT. And they're the ones most qualified to do that, because they're the ones that understand the anatomy that's important to them. And so that's how they get involved on a daily and weekly basis in the chart check and patient's treatment. So so that's kind of how the treatment goes, and that's kind of the whole process. Is there any questions about the process? Anything? No questions? Okay.
When you start as a junior physicist, is there any senior one to sign off after you to check?
Depends on where you are. If you're at a consulting group where there's one physicist per person, they might put you at the easiest site, and they might check your stuff once a week or once a month. At a place where we are, there's 6 physicists, and so there's plenty of people to double check what you've done. And it is a really, if your nature, which to some degree I think is a lot of people's, it certainly is mine, but if your nature is to really quickly say, oh, I know how to do that, and then on second thought figure out, do I really know how to do that? It's not a good area to do that. It's better to say, I don't know, than to guess that you might know. Get in that situation, oh, sure, I know how to do that, and then try and figure out how to do that, and then if you figured it out wrong, it's not like you get a bad grade, it's you treat a patient wrong. And so, that's my advice for that. So this is kind of the whole process. And now we get ready for my coolest slide of the whole thing. So all this is bound together by technology, because technology is a part of this entire thing, and it's what glues all of this together, and it's what every part is using, and it's what I think from now forward only is going to become more a part of what a physicist does. And so where you come in as a physicist is you are the sun that makes everything okay, because you're kind of taken on as the expert in all of these things that you didn't sign on to do. But like I said, the doctor that likes to draw the crayons on the thing, he also doesn't know how to check his email if it logs out overnight and you have to put your password in again. I'm not joking about this. And so you're the one, and the reason I say this is because you have to be prepared to do that, and in my experience, more than anything else, that's what's going to engender the respect for the physician to trust you. Not if you can do their plan right. They expect that. But if you can do their plan right and fix their printer, that's really what gets you to be in That's what really ingratiates you and gets people to start to count on you. And as the different parts of technology involved in this process become more advanced, the more important you are at being able to figure those kinds of things and think on your feet, the more important those things are. So I thought I'd give you some of examples because Mount Sinai is kind of a crazy place. And so these are some of the things I've encountered at being at Mount Sinai, other than the treatment planning and the MU calcs. So, and put this in perspective, we have a full load of patients. We're treating 80 to 90 patients a day, and they're being treated by therapists that only want to go home not 1 minute after they're supposed to go home. And so, and you're treating by doctors who if you're not a minute early, why are you late? And so everything, it only matters the schedule of time. Like the analogy I give is that it's like, working for a newspaper, you can't say, I need 10 more minutes on this article. They're not going to stop the presses for that. If the patient comes to treatment on Monday, the patient will be treated on Monday. And it's more than just, part of it is financially driven, but part of it is biologically driven. I said a patient gets, cancer takes, Saturday and Sunday off. Sometimes for a holiday it takes Monday off, but it doesn't ever take Tuesday or Wednesday off. I mean, at some point, when a patient misses 3 or 4 days in a row, it starts to affect the quality of their treatment and the outcome biologically of their treatment. So it's very important. And so you have to think on your feet a lot. And so you have to understand when the therapists are calling you, they're not like, hey, when you get a chance. So a therapist calls me and says, Aaron, can you come down on the machine? Our mouse won't double click. And I said, what do you mean? And she goes, well, it single clicks okay, but it won't double click. And so, I run down to the machine, and I mean, these aren't things that you're trained to do, but so what had happened was someone else had turned the double click speed up. This was an older therapist, and she couldn't click the mouse fast enough to get the double click to work. But in the meantime, patients are waiting on the couch to be treated, patients in the waiting room. Well, but that's obvious now, but when someone just calls you and says the double click doesn't work, the single click works, but I mean, that's not necessarily the first thing you think of, right? And so, so another thing is that, so the machine, I don't know if you guys have seen a machine, but here's the collimator, here's where the radiation comes out of. There's a crosshair right here, which is just like a gun crosshair, I guess, that just marks the center of radiation. It's pretty important. And so a therapist calls us one day and says, can you come here? The crosshair is gone. I mean, this is something that's printed on a piece of plastic, and the crosshairs, you probably have much better stories than this. But, so he says the crosshair is gone, and so we go in there, and one of the helpful therapists thought they would take some alcohol and clean off the crosshair in order to make, the window cleaner, because light shines through this, and so they cleaned off the crosshair like this. So the crosshair looks like this. So in the meantime, they're waiting to treat patients and all this stuff. So, you get a magic marker and draw it back in. But I mean, these are kind of things you don't expect to encounter. Probably the most exciting thing that I've encountered so far was the week after Thanksgiving, before Thanksgiving. I was ready to go home. I was getting a haircut, which I don't do very often. It's not good. But so I was waiting to get my haircut, and they call and say that our server room flooded. Can you come in? And so we keep all of our, the servers, everything, every server for all our treatment planning, all our treatment, everything is kept in one room. And there was a steam pipe above that ruptured, and it was pouring water for 3 hours on a Sunday before anyone noticed into all the computers. And so, we come in, we open the door, and literally the water's like 3 feet high, and it just gushes out everywhere. And so all night, we were up all night that night, taking servers apart and dumping water out with a hairdryer. I have a great picture, but my friend didn't give it to me in time. Trying to dry off all the motherboards so we could see what was working and what wasn't. And so you were probably involved in that at some point. So, these are kinds of things that you're always forced to, and I think that these are what make the most exciting part of the job, because these are all the things that make you think on your feet. And I think this is what being a physicist is, because more than knowing how to do a stupid MU calc or knowing how to do a treatment plan, what you train to be as a physicist is to be a problem solver. And I think that that's where you're really unique in your ability to help, is to be able to solve problems. So I think it's important to be eager to solve those and be comfortable doing that. So, what time is it? It's probably really late by now, huh?
Anytime you want, up to 5:30.
Oh, great. You guys, I'll see. You guys have class after. Yes. Oh, do you have a question? No? Okay. There we go. I figured once you didn't answer after 10 seconds, probably not. So, So I kind of center this whole thing around external beam therapy. There's other kinds of therapy, and the reason I call these the trifecta is because I think most of us probably want to become, the end goal of this career, I guess, is to be a chief physicist. And wherever you end up getting your first job or whatever, the kinds of 3 things that you have to know to be able to do that are IMRT, which is becoming more and more popular to be used, radiosurgery, and brachytherapy. I think those are kinds of the 3 things. There's lots of other weird things people do, new kinds of treatments, but those are kind of the cornerstone. It's not a corner if it's a triangle, but anyway, those are the 3 things. And so kind of go through each of them. I don't know to what degree you've covered this in Dr. Wu's class. He covers a lot of material, so I don't know. It's hard to retain all of that. It's like impossible more than hard. And so HDR is a brachytherapy treatment where, let's see, before I go on, do you guys know what HDR treatment is? No? Okay, so do you know what brachytherapy is? Kind of more or less? Okay, so HDR is basically brachytherapy. What happens is that this is called an afterloader, and what's kept in here is an iridium-192 source, which is a very high specific activity. So it's the size of a grain of rice, and it has 10 curie of activity when it's new. So 10 curie, that's huge. And so this is actually one of the most critical and error-prone treatments. I mean, where an error is incredibly damaging is in this kind of treatment. And so what happens is the patient is simmed. You usually do a plan, and so a tube or a catheter is attached to this that then enters the patient through an applicator. Usually, what we treat in Mount Sinai, what's most commonly treated with this is endometrial cancer, which is a vaginal cylinder that is the applicator. You can imagine what that is. Other kinds of things are a mammocyte, which is a applicator that's actually put into the breast, where this catheter goes into, and another, I don't know. That's all that's coming to the top of my head. But so what happens is that, this source is so powerful. I mean, there's no shielding good enough to be in the room for any length of time. So what happens is you set the patient up, you simulate the patient, and then this little grain of rice comes out on a tube, and it goes into this applicator, and then the computer optimizes based on your planning how long that little grain of rice stays at each position, and then that grain of rice moves along, in order to create a dose distribution of what you want. So, for example, here's the vaginal cylinder, and as you guessed, it looks like a cylinder, and then right through the center runs this applicator. And so the grain of rice will pause. It's not a grain of rice, really. It's iridium-192, but it looks like a grain of rice. So it'll pause here for X number of seconds. It'll pause here for X number of seconds and go on down through the tube. And so what you end up getting for each of these, you get kind of a circular dose distribution. But when you pause for all of these, what you end up getting in the end is a nice cylindrical dose distribution for the area that you want to treat. So, so what physics does for that is they do the QA for that. There's a lot of, because again, this is kind of a, there's not a lot of room for error. There's not electricity you can just turn off if something goes wrong. And so every day, if there's treatments being done that day, there's specific QA procedures to make sure that this rice is in the right place, that it will retract, that all your emergency interlocks are in place. That has to be done on a daily basis. I don't know. That's kind of all there is. And then, of course, the planning that goes on with that to decide how long the grain of rice is here. And then, does anyone know the half-life of iridium-192? Simon knows. Come on. No? It's 73 days, I think. It's like 72-ish, 73-ish. So, so that needs to be replaced about every 4 months, 4 times a year, 3 times a year, 4 times a year, every 3 months. I don't know. It needs to be replaced about every 3 or 4 months. And so you're then involved every time that that's replaced in making sure that the new one, that the activity that the company tells you that it is in agreement with what you measure, because in the end, you're the one signing off saying that this activity, not the company, they're not responsible. You sign off and say that this activity is okay to treat patients, and it is what we think it is. So that's how physics, yeah.
How much coverage does this get in our curriculum?
I don't know, maybe at least 10 minutes in Dr. Wu's class, maybe 5. But, I mean, there's just not enough time. There's a lot of stuff here, and so I mean, this is something I had, for most part, no idea about until I did it on the job. And this is something that I think there's other things that if you come into a job not knowing, you'll get killed for that. It won't look good. This is not one of those things. I think you should learn about it, but I mean, I think if you don't know this from day one, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world if you don't know how to do this. So you should know the general concept of how it works. Yeah.
I heard from a colleague a horrible story that with these after loaded, the source gets stuck.
Oh, that's why I said mistakes are bad there.
Come into the room to risk all these overexposure to pull something out physically.
Right, so this little grain of rice is attached to a cable, and if it falls off, that's part of your job. And this is why I say it's a chance to interact with the patient. Not really, but you have to go in and use your Geiger counter and measure that the source is actually not in the patient anymore and back in the afterloader. And so different things of careless things have happened. And this is kind of where it takes a little bit of tact because, like, for example, we use the same Geiger counters that we use in your lab, and they go doot, 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 doot. And so you want to turn that off in front of a patient because a patient gets freaked out, even if they don't understand that there's a little bit of background no matter where you are. So they're like, doot, doot, doot. Why is it going doot, 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 doot? So yeah, I mean, you kind of have to be careful of those sorts of things.
But I suppose you don't have a house physics to help you monitor the sources. It's all done by yourself,
right? Yeah. I mean, it's all done by physics. Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, like in Columbia, if you handle a radioactive source, you have to let the radiation safety or the health physics office know that they have somebody to monitor and make sure that that's if something goes wrong.
That's if something goes wrong, right. The only time that this source goes, health physics knows about is when it comes in and when the old one leaves. When you replace it, yeah. But yeah, there are horror stories about this. I don't know any specific ones about this, but one that I do know about is that a source was left in a patient. They didn't properly monitor. The patient went home and 2 days later felt ill and died. I mean, so it's not good. So I mean, you have to be really, really careful about these sorts of things. So let's see. Okay, so LDR. So what happens are seeds are implanted into the patient. These are permanent implants. They give a much lower dose, whereas the HDR, a patient will usually come in one time a week. Depending on the treatment, for a vaginal cylinder, they'll come in once a week for 5 weeks. And it will deliver a high dose of radiation that one day of the week. This is implanted permanently, say, into the patient's prostate. And so by definition, that's a permanent implant. So you're the one that calibrates the seeds, make sure that they are the dose the company says. And if they're not, they're in the patient for all time. So you better make sure that they are. And so so that's why mistakes are bad. Usually, physics also does the calculations at the time of the implant, and that can be a really stressful situation because you're in an OR, and the patient's there, legs in stirrups, in a wonderful position with gigantic needles into their perineum, and there's going to be 3 or 4 doctors waiting on you to finish your calculations. They'll have no understanding if you do them too quickly and are wrong. They have to be right. But you have a room of doctors waiting on you to finish. And behind them, you have a room of doctors that are about to go in the room that are waiting for you to finish. So it can be a really high-pressure situation, which I think is part of the excitement of the job. But, I mean, you have to be comfortable and okay in that kind of environment. So we don't do the planning at Mount Sinai for typical prostate, but that's how it goes. So I don't know that this is the other thing you do is after the patient is simulated, you go through and find all the seeds. This is also mind-numbing, kind of like doing your taxes only visually with a picture, and you go in and find where the seeds are implanted. This is just done for record-keeping purposes. Once the seeds are implanted, it's not like you could say, "Oh, that one's in the wrong place. We should correct that." No, there's nothing you can do about it, but we do it for record-keeping purposes. So then stereotactic radiosurgery is another thing physics involved. Physics usually always does the planning for stereotactic radiosurgery. The dose of radiation is usually given is so high that it immediately oblates the cells. It kills them instantly, or more or less. And so what will happen is if you take a CT a month later, there will be actually a white spot of necrotic tissue where you irradiated. And so this is somewhere where, not like this is okay at any time, but I mean, you can't miss. Because if you're irradiating a brain tumor and a patient comes back 6 months later and the tumor is twice the size, and you see that little white spot is a CM next to the tumor, I mean, there's no hiding from that. And so, I mean, also you've done a disservice to the patient. to say the least. So physics usually does the planning for this. There's also a check called the Winston-Lutz check, where you check to see that the radiation isocenter of the machine and the mechanical isocenter of the machine are coincident. That's done usually every day before the treatment. And then you help also localize the patient and make sure that they're set up correctly. Most places that do radiosurgery deal with sub-millimeter accuracy. And, when you're dealing with, human person with biological things that move and change, asking for things to be within a millimeter is quite a bit to ask. Look at a millimeter on a ruler, and it's pretty impressive. Yeah.
What, if any?
Oh, 0 on this one that I remember. I don't know if you guys have covered this. This one we didn't talk about at all. Again, something if you don't know day one doesn't matter, and could take an hour, could take longer. And so, you're doing this while everyone's behind you kind of, tapping their thumbs and waiting for you to be done. And so, again, another example of somewhere where you have no room to make a mistake, but there's somewhat of a time pressure to finish the job.
Why couldn't that be done more in advance?
Because the planning is done off of the CT. The CT, on the CT you have the brain, right? Kind of looks like that a little bit. That looks like a baseball, but anyway. And the localizer, like I say, is surgically attached. And so the computer uses the coordinates of that localizer and to find the tumor relative to that localizer. And sub-millimeter accuracy that's very, very accurate. And so even though things inside your brain don't move really at all, they move enough that you need it to be done same day in order for the relationship for this tumor relative to this localizer to be unchanged. Until the surgery comes, you can't do the planning, right? So, okay, so this is kind of all the things we do. What happens kind of a day in the life of me? Wow, that's exciting. So probably I spend 50 to 75% of my time doing planning, various types of planning, IMRT planning, 3D planning, HDR planning, whatever the case might be, sitting in a computer doing planning. The chart checks I was telling you about usually happens once a week. You have one day where, it takes a couple of hours and you get all of those done. This is going to vary place to place. We do brachytherapy, HDR, and we do radiosurgery once a week, the same day every week, and so we kind of rotate through that, but you have one day a week where that takes up your time. So, and then the best part is the after hours. Of course, any work you do on the machine, any measurements, patients are being treated the whole day, so anything you do like that is done after hours or on the weekend. We work very, 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 very late, so we don't ever have to come in on the weekend. But we've been there till 2 or 3 in the morning to try and get measurements done for annual measurements and that sort of thing. So so that's kind of what's done after hours. IMRT QA is done after hours, and then any research that you have the energy left to do also done after hours. And so that's kind of what happens. So it gives, if you're in a place that does lots of different kinds of treatment, in the long, you're doing the same thing every week and every month, but you're doing a different thing every day, I guess. And so it kind of brings some variety to your life, and variety is the spice of something. So. And then, of course, you're always, this is always broken up by you sit down and do a treatment plan, and then the mouse doesn't double-click, and then you sit down and do a treatment plan again, and then, the crosshair's gone. So this is broken up by a million different things, and so that kind of all those kinds of things are always kind of pulling against you a little bit. So, and then there's, of course, with every job, there's paperwork and other kinds of stuff. So I think I have a hideous slide coming up. So, I've kind of talked about the mistakes that kind of go on. This was a patient that was treated at Memorial, and it was a combination. It's not just the physicist, but they didn't account. This was a single fraction treatment of the spine. One fraction, I think the patient received 18 gray, and they didn't account for what that would do to the skin. The physicists used all posterior beams that came from the patient's back, and entered pretty much in the same spot. And so the skin couldn't handle that, and so it ulcerated. And so not only does that look horrible, and that be bad for anyone in our situation in life, but when you're dealing with someone that has cancer and the limited amount of quality of life that they may have, something like this is much worse for them than it would be for someone else. And so this is really, really horrible. And so I guess this is one example of one thing that could happen, and I kind of call it the 90% rule, and it's kind of points out the monotony of the job, but also the importance of the job. Because you're going to do all these second checks on all these things, on your HDR, on your external beam, on all these different things, and 90% of the time, everything's going to be fine. And of the 10% of times when something's wrong, this is not scientific, about 90%. Of the 10% of the time when something's wrong, it's something that doesn't matter. A field is given the wrong label, a person is given 5% of MUs too high because the therapist forgot to account for the block in the right way or something like that. So 90% of that time, everything's going to be fine. And then of that time, of the 90% of that time, everything still is going to be okay. You might have to write you might have to do a misadministration report, but you're not going to affect the outcome of the health of the patient. And so all you're left with that is that 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1, when what you do and the mistake that you miss is going to impact the life of the patient in a very serious way. And so what I'm trying to say is that it's hard because every month you're going to do your Linac calibrations, and every month it's going to be fine, just like it was last month. And what you have to be good at is you have to be cognizant enough to know when it's not okay. And you can't ever get sloppy about that because you don't ever know when it's not going to be okay. Even though that the last 100 times you did it, it was fine, you have to understand and have respect for the fact that 101st time it might not be okay. So, another example of something that happened that was really bad was at a hospital that actually happened locally. I think this was a couple of years ago. A patient was treated a head and neck treatment with IMRT. The monitor units for IMRT are typically around 400 times for a head and neck plan, around 400 times higher than the equivalent 3D treatment. And so what happens is these MLC, these jaws, move across the field, and so the reason it's okay that the MUs are 500 times higher is because usually the field is mostly closed during the length of the treatment. Well, they didn't realize that some computer error had happened that they had ignored, and the fields were all open. So the patient was treated for 3 treatments with open fields, 4 times the amount of dose that they should have gotten. I think within a couple of weeks the patient died. I mean, so that's something that's 1 in 1,000 times. And you're going to have to check that 999 times, and it's going to be right every time, and you're going to have to recognize the one time it's not. So that's, I think, the challenge, and that's a challenging part of the job, I guess. So, okay, we're getting towards the end. I know that's wonderful. So here's kind of remembering back what I felt like was both in preparation for the ABR exam and, well, let me say this. For the ABR exam, really almost everything you learn in your classes is more important. I think the things that, if I had to pick your class, obviously Dr. Wu's class, and the radiobiology part of Dr. Zeider's class were probably the things I drew on the most for studying for the ABR exam. Maybe I would have to pick for part 1 anyway, which is the physics part, probably your class the most. I mean, that's probably what I drew on the most for studying for those exams. I imagine obviously for part 2, which I haven't taken yet, which is the clinical therapy part, I'll probably draw on Dr. Wu's class the most. But so let me say that from the outset. Now, as far as what applies to the job, the radiobiology part of Dr. Zeider's class I think is really, really important. I have a book on the list that I don't know if any of you guys have picked it up, but you'll read through that book and go, oh, that's what he was talking about. Oh, that's what I was really amazing when I read that book. And so I think that's what's important. I think from John's lab, what's really important is to understand the instrumentation, how they're used, why they're used that way. You need to be very good at being able to say, I need to measure radiation in this way, this kind of radiation, what instrument do I use? And you need to be able to very confidently say that. I had a patient that came in, and the patient was actually a PhD physicist himself, and he liked to hold his cat on his lap, but he had a prostate implant. And so he was concerned about the warnings he got about, not having children lay on your lap for X amount of weeks after the implant. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to have his prostate measured externally with a Geiger counter. And we said, well, that's not a good way to measure the amount of dose your cat would be getting, and he wanted to know why. So you have to have it in your arsenal, if you will, to be able to explain to him, why that is. And so, so I think that's what's important from that. You're comparing dose that you measure from your machine. You're comparing output from your TLDs to your ion chamber. Your TLDs are off. They differ by 10%. Which one do you trust? Those kinds of questions, I think you learn a lot from your class. How why would which one is more accurate? Why? Those kinds of things I think are really important. What else do I say? Yeah, all that is the kind of stuff you need to know. From radiation physics, I think that, there's a lot important in that class. I think you need to be really comfortable with the physics of TG21 and TG51. Now, understand that I've worked with physicists that have been doing this job for 10 years, and every time the annual QA comes around, whereas the only time you pull out TG51, they've got to go back and look through, too, how it works. So, don't have those kinds of expectations, but you need to be able to glance through it and understand quickly, remind yourself, not learn again how it works, or not learn for the first time. Understand the physics of ion chambers, that kind of stuff. And then I just listed stuff for Wu's class, but everything for Wu's class. Just don't leave anything out, assuming you're becoming a therapy physicist. So, and then for CTs, you don't use that on a daily basis. It's important to know it's not important to know the theory of MRI, but it's important to know what tissues show up dark when it's a T1 weighted, what tissues show up bright when it's a T2 weighted, those kinds of things. You'll be tested on that in the ABR exam, but it's important, on a daily basis. You don't want to, bones show up black on an MRI. It looks really strange. You don't want to be talking to a doctor and they're saying, why do these things match? Well, this one's black and this one, you need to know what you're talking about. It's important to understand how CTs work, to understand how artifacts, where they come from, why they're there, to understand their perspective, windowing, that sort of stuff. And then especially with the intro of daily imaging, taking KV imaging for patient localization, I think it's important to know about X-ray imaging, just simple projection X-ray imaging. If I need more contrast, do I turn the KV up or down? If my image has too much model, do I turn the MAS up or down? Those kinds of things. It's important to, I think, know that sort of stuff from there. And health physics, I felt like I didn't need to know anything from health physics for a while, but then when studying for the ABR exam, you really need to know, those stupid dose limits, which I've learned 100 times, and I still don't remember them. You need to know, what happens when you get 1 gray instantaneous dose? What happens when you get 10 gray instantaneous dose? What happens if you get 6 gray to your testicles? What happens if you get 2 gray to your testicles? All those kinds of things. You need to know what happens in those cases. You need to know what happens when, moist desquamation happens to your skin. You need to know when dry desquamation happens. Those kinds of things. You need to know the annual limit for a worker, the annual limit for a not worker, the annual limit for maybe exposed. All those kinds of things you need to know. You just need to know those things. The better you know them off the back of your hand, the better you look. But for when studying for the ABR exam, you need to know all of that. Ridiculous stuff. You need to know what the average dose someone gets from diagnostic tests in a given year. Whether it's okay to give a pregnant woman a barium enema. Those kinds of things. That's the stuff you need to know from that. Eventually, I imagine if you become a chief physicist, you'll need to know how to do shielding calculations, but that's kind of long in the future for me. I imagine for you guys too. So, but eventually you should certainly understand the concept of that. Like I said, outside of courses, I think it's really important to know those clinical terms, directional terms. Learn as much anatomy as you can so you just don't sound like an idiot talking about it because, I think there is a degree, physicians can be very skeptical of the people they let into their comfort zone because, in the end, if a patient's treated wrong, even if it's your fault, you're not responsible for it. You might lose your job, but you're not legally responsible for it. The doctor is. And so, there's a certain trust that needs to be established, and I think that the more you can speak intelligently about their field, staging, those sorts of things, I think the better off you are, cancer staging and that sort of thing. I have a list of books and papers I wish I read or knew that existed. So I think kind of in summary, I think that the positive parts of the job is, in the end of the day, you can go home and say, I was helping people today. Lots of jobs you can't do that. What you do in the end makes a real impact on someone's life. And so I think that's the good thing. I think it's really fun to solve problems, however crazy the problems are. So that's another good aspect of the job. You get to work with a lot of, we got a rapid arc treatment. We were the second people in New York to do that. We're treating patients with something that, only, at the time we got it, that only a few people in the country were doing. That's kind of a unique experience to be able to be in. And for me, I put it as a positive and negative at the time. I really like, my personality, you could attest to this. I could let something drag on for eternity if someone will let me do that. But so it really helps me to have, this patient starting on Monday. I got to do it. That to me brings an excitement to the job. But like I said, it's also a negative because it brings a stress also. And, they can be irregular hours. For the most part, it's a 9-to-5 job. But, again, patients need to be treated on Monday. If something goes wrong over the weekend, you can't say, I'll fix it. I'll come in early Monday morning. You know that very well. It's got to get done. And it's got to get done in the time it needs to get done. So, probably you guys are all curious about getting a job if you still want to do this. And so I think the most important thing to learn, especially, I wish I would have told you guys this in September, but this field is a small inbred field, and everybody knows everyone. If you make an enemy somewhere, everyone will know. They might disagree with that person, but everyone will know that person doesn't think you're good. Likewise, if you make a good impression, that will spread like wildfire also, and everybody knows you're good. Everybody in New York knows who the bad physicists are, and everybody in New York, to a point that's true. And I think that's even true across states and across the country. It's just such a small field. Our dosimetrist went and interviewed in California. Some random dude in California. And a couple days later, her boss, my boss, also said, "What were you doing interviewing in California? I worked with that guy X number of years ago in here, everybody knows everyone, and I think that you need to, in every interaction you have with someone, need to be remembering that. As far as getting a job, I think that volunteering is so important because someone is really taking you on. You're going to be useless when you start a job. For most of you, if you have experience in dosimetry, that's a different thing. But for most of you, you're going to be entirely useless. And so you have to be willing to say, hey, I'm going to let you be useless for a while and spend my time making you not useless, so then you can be useful for me. And you have to find someone willing to do that. And so, that's not easy for someone to do, especially when money's involved and patient safety is involved. And so, 5 years ago, when there was 10 jobs for every 5 physicists looking for a job, they didn't have that luxury. They do now, and so be aware of that. And that's why I think volunteering is important, because there's no better way to prove to someone that you're going to be good without any risk to them than to volunteering there. You'll also see stuff that you'll never see in practicum in a classroom or anything like that. I think the best resources for finding a job, not really. See, again, it's all inbred. Most jobs, I would guess, I don't know statistics on this, I would guess most jobs are found by hey, do you know someone that you know a good physicist? Or do you know someone who's going to be a good physicist? Or, hey, I need a physicist, that kind of thing. That's how most jobs are found. That's how I found my job. I have many friends who found jobs that way. It's really hard, and I think the minority of cases are where you just send an email to someone, hey, I'd really like to meet you, I'm looking for a job. I just think that's not usually how it happens. But, that route or to get to know what jobs are opening, AAPM has a listing. If you're a student member, then you have access to. And also, you guys should all sign up for the Wayne State medical physics thing. They do digests that are emailed out once a week or once a day, I don't know, a long time, or very often. And it kind of gets you to know of the things that are currently going on in the field. It kind of keeps you up to date as to what problems people are wondering about and what kinds of things physicists are thinking about. And also that's where a lot of people choose to post their jobs. I would say the majority of jobs don't go on AAPM, even though that's more or less the official place to put them. I think I'm done.
Do we have this on CourseWorks?
Oh, sure. As long as you guys listen to my thunder crash. Everyone needs to ooh and ah at that. It took like frickin' 3 hours to do.
That was a challenge.
Yes, it was a challenge.
Very good.
So before you guys go, I'm going to pass out this list, and let me explain it to you guys a little bit, because I imagine regarding your predicament, again, it's something I wish I could have talked to you guys about in September. But I don't know how many of you guys know about these books or don't know about these books. This certainly isn't a comprehensive list, but as many as I can think of. There's a couple you might want to highlight. The Bentel book, the first one on the list. I don't know if that one is still in its first. It's still in the same edition. I think there's a new edition out. But that's a really good list, because another thing you need to be able to talk about, no one's treated with... Most 3D plans aren't used as frequently anymore because we have 3D planning now. We have a lot more computer resources. But you need to know what the traditional 3D treatment for an esophageal cancer is. You need to know what a traditional lung treatment is, because and so that's a good book for that sort of thing. I have the paper I mentioned by Imami there that has the old-fashioned dose stuff. Not old-fashioned, but a little bit older. The Hall book, Radiobiology for the Radiologist. I don't know if you have that book, but that will explain almost every bit of radiobiology in Dr. Zeider's class. If there was anything you didn't understand, that book will explain it all. I know it's too late for you guys, but if you're looking for problems for Wu's class, he doesn't like to give them out. The Handy Radiation Therapy Physics has problems in it, and the Johns and Cunningham, they're old problems. A lot of the problems are TAR instead of TMR because there was not high energy machines, but it explains them, and there are problems with answers if you get the solution manual, which if you get it directly from the publisher, it's like $20. If you buy it off of eBay, it's like $400. So get it from the publisher. So those are the only two therapy books I know of that have actual problems in there that are even close to as hard enough as what you would need to know for Wu's class. I don't know, I hate Khan. I don't know why I put that book on there, but that's a different book by him. This Clinical Oncology by Saunders, that's kind of an overview of kind of, usually a lot of therapist students do that, but that kind of gives you a bigger picture than any other book you'll find. And same with the Washington Lever, the last book on the list. I can't remember which one. The Clinical Oncology will teach you a lot about staging and different kinds of things, why a doctor is treating a disease that way. I don't know, check them out. Go to Amazon. And then for the ABR, these are great. So the MedPhys board preparation, that's a Yahoo group, and that's where people will go on every year. So there's no study guide for the ABR exam. You go to the ABR website, I don't know if any of you guys have done this, and they put out like 10 questions that they don't give you the answer to, that they say that this is your study guide. And then it says, basically it says, but in general, know all things relating to medical physics. I mean, literally that's what it says. And so it's impossible to do that because obviously they focus on things, and they focus on the same things mostly every year. And so the MedPhys board is a site that people go to. How many people know about this or are members of this? So it's a site people go to every year when the ABR exam's done, and they'll go and regurgitate every question they remember from the exam. And so then for future years, you know, there's all kinds of inaccuracies, and be careful what you look at, but it's a pretty good idea of what's going to be on the exam. There's also a thing out called the Rosemart file. It's like a 500 megabyte CD. It's on a CD. I have the file. I'd be happy to pass it out to you guys, but I'd feel uncomfortable with the copyright giving one to all these people. You know, I got it from someone. It's out of print now. You can probably get it from someone. The guy who made it, I don't know who it was, got in trouble for making it, but it's around there, and everybody has it. It has ABR exams all the way back to 1980 on it. And I promise you, studying previous problems is the only way to study for that exam. So if you can find a copy of that, find a copy of that. Don't let someone sell it to you. Let someone give it to you for free. And then there's a medphys.org publishing. Oh, wow, the last book got cut off of mine. Okay, anyway, MedPhys Publishing has a lot of study guides for the ABR exam and that kind of thing, and that's where all the RAFEX exams, have you guys heard of all the RAFEX exams are? That's another source for practice problems, although not really. Most of those problems are easier than what you'll get on the exam and in Wu's class, but the idea is there. And, you know, make sure for Wu's class there's the therapy edition of that. I don't know how helpful those are, but anyway, I think that's all I have to say now. Any questions? Come on, someone asked me. Oh, questions. Great.
For voluntary opportunities, how do you go and find those? Is just, you said you have to, it's reference. How do you do that?
So, it depends. I think you mostly find them by just going and asking people and saying, you know, you'll be hard. I mean, people aren't really receptive. They're not like, sure, come on down, you know. I mean, you'll have to, you know, and some people, you know, again, they have their pick of the litter more than you do. So some people, even though it's a volunteer position, will ask, like I remember I went to Roosevelt Hospital, and I said, hey, listen, can I volunteer there? And they said, well, you can, but we're going to need to know you're going to be here this many hours per week on these days. And I was like, I'm in school as a volunteer position. I didn't say this to them, but I thought to myself, you know, I don't know that I can make that kind of commitment. But, you know, I mean, that's the kind of way you just find things out like that. I think that, you know, if you know someone in the field, they'll know someone that might have a volunteer position open. I think that that's the best way to find those sorts of things. There's not a like official pathway to do that, I guess. I think that the best way is just to cold call people, I guess. and do it a lot because they usually won't respond. Yeah.
Two-part question, kind of what you touched on before. When you're volunteering, what exactly are you doing? Are you actually working as, following somebody, a physicist?
So there's a lot of legal issues with that. New York is one of the tougher states. New York, there's a lot of legal ramifications. Even me, having worked for a couple of years and passed Part 1, I can't sign off on HDR treatment because I'm not board certified. So it really depends. They're not going to want you to hurt anyone, and so what you're going to get to do is grunt work that will teach you no medical physics at all whatsoever, but you do that because that's what they want you to do, and then you stay after hours, after your volunteer hours, and ask if you can take up some old patient that was treated 4 years ago and see if you can recreate their plan, or ask if you can observe their monthly QA measurements and promise you won't get in the way and that sort of thing. There's a lot of weirdness in this field. I don't want to say this to discourage you because there's a lot of weirdness because it's just once you learn it, it's not that hard of a job. It's not like you're trying to figure out how to go to the moon. It's pretty easy. It's multiplication, subtraction, addition, and division. And I think that people tend to be protective of what they know for job security reasons. You're not going to find people, let me be your mentor. Let me tell you everything I know so you can do my job. I mean, you just won't find people in this field, many people willing to do that. And so, you kind of have to learn what you can. And luckily, the field is usually easy enough that you can learn what you need on your own. You just need the resources and the availability to do that. Mostly what you're doing with volunteering is just proving yourself to be useful and competent enough to have someone they're willing to take a chance hiring. Anything else?
You're all set? No questions? You're ready to meet reality after graduation? We shall see.
And don't get discouraged. I mean, some of the best people in my class, took a long time to get a job. It's not some poor students got a job right away. So it's not an indication. It's a lot of luck and it's a lot of who you know. Yes.
Is there a reason you went into therapy? And I know most people go into therapy, but is that just for the money?
Let's see. I think that the science of diagnostic imaging is by far the most interesting. It has the most interesting field. It has the most cutting-edge research. The research in therapy physics is pretty boring. It's really clinically based. It's just not very exciting stuff. I think Dr. Zeider was pretty adamant about saying that at this point the physics is so far ahead of the biology that it's just limited of what you can do. And so but I think as a daily job, I think this is the most, assuming you're not going to do research or do academic things, I think this is the most interesting job, Diagnostic, while it's very interesting scientifically, you go to dentist offices, and make sure, and you do monthly QA on their little tooth thingy all the time, and so to me that wasn't as interesting, health physics, that's a lot of paperwork, I think that this was the field that drew the most interest. And if I'm not doing research, I also think it had provided the best and most direct way to interact, to have a positive influence on patients. If you make sure that 120 kV is 120 kV on a dentist machine, sure, it's good, but you're not. I just didn't feel that was as direct of a connection. So, and of course, who can lie? The money is not even really comparable in the other fields. So, that's certainly a benefit also. Yeah.
A question about interviewing. As far as interviewing for a position, once you get out there, what do you really expect? I know in other job interviews they'll ask you other questions. Is it very specific? Is there a lot of things they ask you about physics? How is it?
It's really interesting. I've kind of had the gamut of experiences. I've heard of people that, it's rare, but I've heard of people that actually get technical questions on an interview. Probably not for a first-time job, but maybe, they'll say, I have this patient that has this kind of disease. Here it is. How would you treat it? Those kinds of questions. I don't think that's the norm. Certainly not for a first-time person. That's not the norm. But, mostly you work a lot with people. That's probably the biggest reason I wanted to get in this field, is because unlike doing research, it's really important how you interact with people. And I think mostly what people are looking for is A, that you can learn quickly and are competent, and understand the importance of your job. I don't mean to be elitist. I'm not at all. But to understand the importance, I think they look that you understand the importance. You know, they look to see that you're not someone that, what a great opportunity to make X amount of money, you know, with a physics degree, you know. I think that that's not what they're looking for. I think they're looking for someone that understands the importance of the job, and they're looking for someone that they feel like they can work with, because that's what's different about this field, is that you're working with someone. You're all the time talking to someone. You're all the time going back and forth. Is this the best treatment? Is that the best treatment? If it's someone they can't talk to, I don't think they, you know, I think that's really important. So I think that's probably what they're looking for.
Okay. Thank you very much.